Come closer. The shadows have missed you, and tonight they have a new story to tell. Welcome to Scary Stories After Dark. He preferred arriving before the lights came on. The pool belonged to him most in the hour before morning decided what it was. Still, flat, patient. The banners hanging from the rafters drifted in the quiet circulation of the vents, their championship years swaying like old promises, records, futures, expectations. He carried them all with him as he walked the narrow tile perimeter, hands folded behind his back, dress shoes whispering against damp grout. He stopped at lane 4, looked down into the black seam of water dividing the floor. He could already smell the day's work beneath the chlorine, iron, salt, the faint electric sweetness of bodies pushed past their limits. The filters would turn over soon. The surface would glitter, parents would come with coffees, cameras, hope. But for now, there was honesty. He checked his watch. She would be here any minute. Not one of his, not yet. New ones always trembled before they understood the gift. They mistook fear for wrongness. It was never wrong, it was refinement. He heard the side door open. Sneakers, hesitant, a backpack zipper, breath trying not to sound afraid. Good. Fear meant she understood the importance of what she was about to become. I was told to meet, she began, voice small in the cavern. He raised a finger without looking at her. Not yet. There were rituals to timing. The natatorium lights hummed overhead but did not brighten. They hovered in that gray, almost morning mercy, where shapes remained suggestions. He watched her reflection tremble in the water beside his own, young, athletic, desperate to belong to something greater than herself. They always were. "Do you want to win?" he asked gently. A pause. Yes. Honest answer. They rarely lied at the start. Good, he said. He nodded toward the lane. She swallowed, set the bag down, shoes, socks, shirt, all folded with hopeful care, as if she expected to return to them unchanged. They always did. The first step in was the worst. The cold carried memory. She gasped when it reached her ribs. He watched the far end of the pool, not her. He never watched the beginning. The beginning was ugly and private and full of doubt. What mattered was what came after. Under, he said. She complied. A clean dive would come later after she earned it. The surface closed. Seconds passed. He listened the way other men listened for applause. The vents whispered, water-lapped tile. Somewhere deep in the filtration system, something shifted with ancient patience. Good. Very good. He checked his watch again, longer than most. Promising. When the bubbles finally reached the surface, they were smaller than he expected. He waited for her to come up. They always came up. Another second. Another. The water settled. He tilted his head. Curious. From the corner of his eye, he noticed something drift toward the drain. A pale ribbon of movement, delicate, almost beautiful. Evidence of effort. evidence of change. The pool accepted it without complaint. He exhaled slowly. Adjustments would be necessary. They usually were. Behind him, the morning lights flickered fully awake. In a few hours, reporters would arrive. Cameras, smiles, questions about excellence. He would give them what they wanted. He always did. He took one last look at the water. Then he turned away. The campus looked harmless from the road. That was Sutton's first mistake. Sunlight softened everything. Brick buildings warmed to a friendly red, students crossed lawns with backpacks and laughter, bicycles clicked past like punctuation marks in a sentence that refused to take itself too seriously. Even the banners draped from lampposts felt celebratory instead of imposing. Championship season. She adjusted her grip on the steering wheel and slowed at the turn toward the athletics complex, the tires humming over the asphalt seam as if the road itself were trying to warn her of something just beneath its surface. Her phone was already warm against her ear.
"You're early,"
Jack said. His voice carried that familiar steadiness, the kind that sounded calm until you noticed how carefully each word was placed, like he was stepping across thin ice. "I'm on time," Sutton replied, eyes flicking between the GPS and the rising silhouette of the natatorium ahead. "You're the one who thinks everyone is late unless they're waiting an hour before doors open." A quiet exhale. Not quite a laugh.
"I just want you to be careful."
She smiled despite herself. There it was. Jack Kane never asked her to be careful about deadlines, editors, or disappointing assignments. Only places, only people. "Jack," she said gently. "It's a swim team feature, not a crime scene." The building grew larger as she approached, glass and steel catching the morning light in a way that felt almost theatrical. Through the wide windows, she could see flashes of blue water, the suggestion of movement beneath it, a brightness that seemed too perfect to be natural.
"I know. Just text me when you're done."
Her fingers tightened around the wheel without meaning to. The request wasn't strange. The tone was. "You're acting weird," she murmured.
"I'm always weird."
She huffed a small laugh, but the sound didn't settle the unease gathering low in her chest. Jack had always been intense, always a little too observant, but there was something different now, a quiet urgency that made her skin feel too aware of itself, like she'd stepped into a room where a conversation had just ended. "You're not coming down here, are you?" she asked. A pause, long enough to notice.
"No,"
he said finally. She didn't believe him. Not fully. But she also didn't push. Some instincts weren't ready to be examined yet. They floated in the background like distant thunder, noticeable but not enough to stop the day. She pulled into the parking lot and shifted into park, the engine's sudden silence pressing against her ears harder than the noise had. The building loomed now, no longer softened by distance, its glass reflecting the sky in a way that felt less like transparency and more like concealment. Students moved around her without looking up. Normal, everything was normal. "I'll call you later," she said.
Text first.
Jack replied. She rolled her eyes even as something inside her quietly agreed. Okay. The line clicked off. For a moment she stayed in the car, watching the surface of the pool through the tall windows. Even from outside, she could hear the muffled rhythm of movement, water striking tile, whistles cutting the air, the low mechanical hum of filtration systems working tirelessly to keep something pristine. Chlorine should have smelled clean. Instead, when she opened the door, the faintest trace of metal rode the breeze that slipped through the gap, subtle enough to dismiss, persistent enough to notice. She grabbed her bag, slung the camera strap across her shoulder, and stepped toward the entrance. The doors opened before she reached them. Inside, the air felt heavier, warmer, moist, breathing against her skin in a way that made the back of her neck tighten without explanation. The pool stretched wide and impossibly blue beneath the lights, bodies slicing through lanes with mechanical precision, coaches pacing like conductors guiding an orchestra only they could hear. And the team, the sharks, moved through the space with a confidence that bent attention toward them without effort. Not loud, not overt, just certain. Sutton felt it the moment she stepped onto the tile. The subtle shift in atmosphere when people entered a room knowing they were admired. She adjusted her posture automatically, not out of intimidation, but habit. The quiet instinct to stand a little straighter when surrounded by performance. A swimmer surfaced at the far lane. For a split second, their eyes met across the water. There was no hostility there, no curiosity either. Just assessment. The feeling slid over her like cold water. Sutton didn't look away. She never had. Instead, she lifted her chin slightly, offering the same unspoken message she always carried into unfamiliar spaces. I'm here to see, not to impress. The swimmer dipped back beneath the surface without breaking eye contact. The water closed above them. And Sutton felt inexplicably like she had just been acknowledged by something that had already decided what she was worth. The first thing Sutton noticed wasn't the noise, it was the rhythm. Everything in the natatorium moved according to a pattern she couldn't quite map. Whistles timed to breathing cycles, footsteps pacing the pool's edge like a metronome, the steady churn of filtration humming beneath the surface like a second heartbeat the building was trying to keep hidden. She adjusted the strap of her bag and stepped further onto the tile, the warmth rising through the thin soles of her shoes and settling into her calves in a way that made standing still feel strangely intimate. Water sounds had a way of closing distance. They wrapped around you before you realized you were listening. A group of swimmers cut through the far lanes in synchronized silence, their turns sharp and identical, bodies disappearing beneath the surface without hesitation. It wasn't just athleticism. It was efficiency so precise it bordered on unnatural. No wasted motion, no visible fatigue, no one lingering at the wall to catch breath longer than required. Even their stillness felt rehearsed. Sutton lifted her camera but didn't take the shot yet. Sometimes photographs stole something from a moment that observation could preserve. She preferred the preservation. You must be Sutton Archer. The voice arrived behind her with a gentleness that felt practiced rather than warm. She turned. Coach Halvern stood a few steps away, posture relaxed in the way people only achieved after years of controlling how they were perceived. His smile was easy, professional, the kind that reassured donors and parents without revealing anything that might invite deeper questions. But his eyes didn't match the softness. They were attentive, measuring. "You're early," he added. "I like to see places before they know I'm looking," Sutton replied. The answer came automatically, the small piece of defiance she carried into every room where reputation walked ahead of truth. She watched the subtle flicker of amusement cross his expression, approval, perhaps, or simple recognition of someone unwilling to be impressed. "That's a useful skill," he said. "Though here, I assure you, there isn't much mystery to uncover. Discipline, dedication, and a little bit of luck." Luck. The word hung in the humid air like a polite lie. Sutton nodded as if she believed him. "That's exactly what readers want to understand," she said, lifting her notebook. "How something that looks effortless is usually anything but." Behind him, one of the swimmers paused at the wall, water sliding down their shoulders in thin, reflective lines. They weren't looking at the coach. They were looking at her. Not openly, not rudely, just aware. Coach Halvern followed her gaze but didn't turn his head fully, as if he already knew what she would see. "They're curious," he said. "Success attracts attention, but scrutiny is rarer. You'll find they handle both well." The swimmer pushed off the wall without breaking eye contact. The surface swallowed them again. Sutton felt the faintest chill move across the back of her neck, despite the heat of the room. "I'd like to speak with a few of them individually," she said. "Of course." The answer came too easily. He gestured toward the benches, inviting without commanding, yet the space between them seemed to narrow the moment she stepped forward, a quiet sense that permission had been granted rather than collaboration offered. He walked beside her, hands folded behind his back, gaze drifting across the lanes with a familiarity that felt less like observation and more like ownership. "You'll hear stories about sacrifice," he said. "People romanticize it. They imagine greatness as something accidental, a lucky alignment of talent and opportunity. That isn't how excellence works." Sutton glanced at him. "How does it work?" His smile returned, smaller this time. "Consistency," he said, "and the willingness to become something more than what you were when you arrived." Across the pool, the swimmers surfaced together, breaths drawn in perfect synchronization. For a moment, Sutton felt as though she were witnessing a language she didn't yet understand, something communicated through motion rather than sound, something that existed just beneath the level of ordinary perception. It wasn't frightening, not exactly, but it carried the quiet certainty of a system already in motion long before she stepped inside it. Coach Halvern stopped walking. "They're ready for you," he said. Sutton looked toward the water. The sharks had gathered at the lane wall, watching her with polite interest that didn't quite reach their eyes. She felt the familiar spark of professional excitement rise in her chest, the thrill of proximity to something admired, the possibility of capturing a story before it belonged to everyone else. But beneath it, quieter and harder to ignore, was the sense that she had just been invited into a conversation that had already begun without her, and might not end with her leaving. The closer Sutton moved to the water, the more the air seemed to thicken. Not unpleasant, just present. Humidity pressed gently against her skin, clinging to the small hairs at the back of her neck, turning each breath into something she could feel rather than ignore. The tile beneath her shoes held warmth from hours of movement, the surface faintly slick despite the constant effort to keep it clean. The sharks waited at the wall, not lined up, not posed, but unified in a way that made the space around them feel intentionally organized, as if the water itself understood its role in holding them together. Coach Halvern stepped back without announcement, leaving Sutton at the edge of their orbit like someone being allowed into a conversation rather than introduced to one. Up close, the perfection felt different, less impressive, more precise. Their breathing slowed almost immediately after finishing laps, chests rising and falling in shallow, controlled rhythms that suggested exhaustion was something negotiated rather than experienced. Water clung to their skin longer than expected, forming reflective patches that shimmered beneath the overhead lights before finally slipping away. One of them climbed out first. Lucas Reed. She knew his name before anyone spoke it. The way the others shifted subtly around him made it obvious. Leadership without declaration, the kind people accepted without needing explanation. He pulled himself onto the deck with effortless grace, water trailing from his shoulders in thin streams that gathered near the drain. His expression was open, friendly even, but there was a quiet deliberateness in the way he moved, like every gesture had been practiced until it required no thought. "You're the reporter," he said. Not a question. Sutton met his gaze evenly. "I prefer Sutton." A flicker of amusement touched his mouth. "Lucas," he replied, "though I suppose you already knew that." She didn't answer. Sometimes confirmation gave people more comfort than they deserved. Up close, his eyes held an unusual stillness. Not cold, not unkind, simply observant in a way that suggested he was cataloging more than conversation. The friendliness remained intact, but Sutton couldn't shake the sense that it was layered over something quieter, something that existed whether he chose to reveal it or not. "How long have you been with the team?" she asked, lifting her recorder. "Long enough. You don't really count time here the same way." The answer sounded rehearsed but not defensive, just accurate. Another swimmer surfaced beside them, resting their arms along the edge of the pool. Their gaze moved between Sutton and Lucas without curiosity, as if the interaction were expected rather than noteworthy. Sutton noticed the silence. Not awkward, not tense. Simply waiting. "What drew you to swimming?" she asked. Lucas glanced at the water before answering, the motion subtle but deliberate. "It's honest. You can't fake endurance. The water always tells the truth." The words settled somewhere deeper than intended. Behind him, a swimmer pushed off the wall without warning, slicing through the lane with sudden speed that disrupted the calm surface just enough to ripple outward before smoothing again. Sutton watched the disturbance fade. "You win a lot," she said. Lucas's smile returned, polite, practiced. "We work hard." The others didn't speak, but Sutton felt their attention tighten in the space between breaths, the unspoken awareness of reputation hanging heavier than the humid air. Not arrogance exactly, confidence that had never been challenged long enough to fracture. She felt a familiar resistance rise in her chest. Admiration without curiosity had never interested her. "What does losing look like here?" she asked. The question landed differently. Not confrontational, just unexpected. Lucas held her gaze a second longer than necessary, the friendliness still present, but now edged with something sharper, recognition, perhaps, or the quiet realization that she was not here to repeat the story they preferred. "We don't," he said simply. The answer wasn't boastful. It was factual. A swimmer at the far lane surfaced abruptly, breath louder than the others, eyes flicking toward Lucas before settling back into practiced calm. The moment was brief enough to dismiss, but Sutton felt the tiny fracture in the room's rhythm, the suggestion of tension that vanished almost as soon as it appeared. Lucas noticed her noticing. The smile softened. "You'll find we're very disciplined," he added. Sutton nodded, though the reassurance felt less comforting than intended. As she lowered her recorder, something shifted in the water beside the drain, a pale flicker just beneath the surface before disappearing into the filtration grate. So subtle it might have been a trick of the light. She didn't react. But somewhere in the quiet space between observation and understanding, the faintest sense of wrongness began to settle. Not loud enough to alarm, not clear enough to name, just persistent in the way certain instincts refused to be ignored once they had been noticed. Lucas followed her gaze for a fraction of a second, then he looked back at her, expression unchanged. And Sutton realized, with a clarity she couldn't explain, that whatever she had almost seen, he already knew was there. Sutton didn't notice them at first. That was the point. The stands weren't crowded, a few scattered students pretending to study, a lifeguard off-duty scrolling through their phone, the quiet hum of normal life trying to coexist with the focused intensity unfolding below. The space above the pool felt detached from it, like an observation deck overlooking a different ecosystem entirely. But observation has weight, and she could feel it before she saw it. The sensation of being studied without hostility, the subtle awareness of eyes that weren't interested in admiration or performance, but in something quieter, more cautious. The difference between spectators and witnesses. She followed the feeling. 5 of them sat together near the middle rows, close enough to see clearly, but far enough to avoid drawing attention. A formation that suggested habit rather than coincidence. Their conversation had stopped the moment she turned, the unfinished posture of it lingering in the way their shoulders angled toward one another even in silence. Not intimidated, not welcoming. Guarded. Sutton Ellison was the first to hold her gaze without looking away. Grief had a posture Sutton recognized instantly, the rigid stillness of someone bracing against questions they had already answered too many times. Her arms were folded tightly across her chest, fingers tucked into her sleeves as if warmth were something she needed to protect rather than receive. Beside her, Gabe Rowe watched with the measured calm of someone cataloging possibilities instead of reacting to them, while Clara Hart's attention flickered between Sutton and the pool below in quiet intervals, noticing more than she intended to reveal. Finn Pike offered the smallest half-smile, reflexive politeness warring with the unease that refused to leave his eyes. And Cade Moreno. Cade wasn't looking at Sutton at all. His gaze was fixed on the water. Not casually, hungrily. Sutton felt the subtle shift in her own posture as she climbed the steps toward them. Not defensive, not authoritative, just aware in the way people became when entering conversations already carrying emotional weight. "You're watching the team," she said, stopping a respectful distance away. It wasn't an accusation, just an acknowledgement. Sloane's mouth pressed into something that might have been a smile if it had reached her eyes. "We're not fans," she said. The honesty landed harder than hostility would have. Sutton nodded once, accepting the boundary without challenging it. "I'm Sutton," she offered. "We know," Gabe replied gently. "Reporters don't exactly blend in here." There was no bitterness in the comment, only fatigue, the quiet recognition of patterns that repeated without changing outcomes. Sutton shifted her bag on her shoulder. "I'm not here to make anyone uncomfortable." "That's usually how it starts," Sloane said. The words weren't sharp. They were tired. Silence stretched between them, filled by the rhythmic echo of swimmers cutting through the water below, the mechanical certainty of laps continuing regardless of who sat above them watching. Sutton followed their gaze. The sharks moved with the same flawless precision, laughter occasionally breaking the surface like something rehearsed rather than spontaneous. "They were friends with Tessa," Clara said softly. Not a question. An offering. The name changed the air. Sutton felt it immediately, the way grief reshaped space, the invisible boundary between conversation and memory. She saw the small, involuntary reactions ripple through the group. Finn's shoulders tightening, Gabe's jaw setting, Sloane's eyes closing just long enough to betray the effort of holding herself together. Cade finally looked away from the pool. "She didn't disappear," he said. The certainty in his voice carried more fear than anger. "They just stopped looking." Sutton felt the quiet click inside herself. The moment professional curiosity began to blur with something more personal, something harder to detach from once it had been recognized. "I'm sorry," she said. Not a reporter's apology, a human one. Sloane studied her carefully, searching for performance and finding none. "That's what everyone says," she replied. "It doesn't change anything." Below them, Lucas surfaced, laughter breaking across the lane as another swimmer nudged him playfully. The scene looked ordinary from a distance, friends, teammates, success unfolding in real time. But up here, the laughter sounded different, like something happening behind glass. "We tried telling people," Finn murmured. "But when the winning keeps happening, people stop asking uncomfortable questions." Sutton looked back at the water. The brightness of it felt almost aggressive now. "What do you think happened?" she asked quietly. Sloane's answer came without hesitation. "I think something here eats the parts of people no one wants to notice are missing." The words lingered. Not dramatic, not unbelievable. Just possible enough to stay. And for the first time since stepping into the natatorium, Sutton felt the subtle shift in her priorities, the quiet realization that the story she had come to capture might not be the one she needed to tell. The sound of the pool followed Sutton long after she stepped back onto the hallway tile. It wasn't loud, just persistent. The muffled slap of water against the lane lines, the distant whistle, the low mechanical churn of filters cycling beneath the surface, like a second system operating independently from everything visible. Even with the doors closed, the rhythm lingered, echoing faintly in the space between her thoughts. She paused beside the glass overlooking the deck. From here, the scene softened. The sharks looked almost ordinary again, athletes cooling down, laughter threading through conversation, towels slung over shoulders in careless familiarity. The strangeness she'd felt moments earlier became easier to question from a distance, easier to file under atmosphere rather than evidence. But the memory of the stand stayed with her. Sloane's stillness, Finn's quiet desperation, Cade's gaze lingering too long on the water. The emotional weight of it pressed against the neat framework Sutton had arrived with. Interview questions, story angles, professional distance. She felt those structures loosening, threads pulled gently by something she didn't yet understand but couldn't dismiss. Her phone buzzed. Jack. She stared at the screen a moment before answering, suddenly aware of how difficult it would be to explain a feeling that had no shape yet.
Well?
He asked. No greeting, just the question. They're impressive, Sutton said, the word tasting insufficient the moment it left her mouth.
And?
The hallway smelled faintly of chlorine even here, the scent embedded in the building's ventilation like something impossible to wash out completely. And something feels off, she admitted. Silence stretched on the line. Not surprised, not relieved, just waiting.
What kind of off?
Jack asked. Sutton leaned her shoulder against the glass, watching Lucas dive again with effortless confidence, the water folding around him without resistance. The kind you can't point to without sounding dramatic, she said. Like everyone is performing normalcy instead of living it. Jack exhaled softly.
I need you to promise me something.
She closed her eyes briefly. That sounds like a bad idea already.
If it stops feeling like a feature story, you walk away.
The request landed heavier than intended. Sutton opened her eyes, gaze drifting back to the pool where Cade now stood at the edge of the lane, speaking quietly with one of the sharks, posture caught somewhere between admiration and hesitation. I can't promise that, she said. She didn't mean to answer so quickly, but the truth had already settled. Jack didn't argue.
That's what I was afraid of.
Sutton lowered her phone, letting the conversation end without ceremony, and pushed away from the glass. The hallway stretched ahead in quiet fluorescent calm, lockers lining one wall, the distant murmur of students moving through ordinary routines that felt disconnected from the atmosphere she had just left behind. She turned toward the exit. Halfway down the corridor, something caught her eye. Near the base of a drain where water from the deck occasionally seeped beneath the door, a pale shape clung to the tile. Too delicate to be debris, too structured to be dismissed as residue. Sutton slowed without realizing it, crouching instinctively as the faint metallic undertone she'd noticed earlier sharpened in the humid air. It was smaller than she expected. Translucent, iridescent. The edges curved in a way that suggested growth rather than breakage. She hesitated before touching it, the quiet instinct to leave evidence undisturbed warring with curiosity that had already crossed the line into need. When her fingers finally closed around it, the texture felt wrong. Not brittle, not soft, something in between, like a material designed to flex rather than fracture. A scale. The word arrived without permission. She stared at it longer than necessary, mind searching for rational explanations that refused to hold. Costume material, athletic tape, something synthetic. None of them felt convincing. The pool sounds continued behind the door, steady and indifferent, as if the discovery happening in the hallway existed outside the story unfolding inside. Sutton slipped the scale into the inner pocket of her bag. The decision felt automatic. Private, not yet something she was ready to explain. As she stood, a faint ripple of movement passed beneath the door's narrow window, the surface of the pool shifting in a way she couldn't see clearly but could feel, the subtle awareness of something stirring just beyond her line of sight. She didn't go back inside. But she didn't leave immediately either. For a moment, Sutton Archer stood alone in the hallway, holding a secret she didn't understand, feeling the quiet weight of a choice that had already begun to reshape her role in a story she could no longer pretend was simple. And somewhere deep beneath the water she could no longer see. Something had noticed her noticing. The air outside felt thinner, not cooler, just easier to breathe, the weight of humidity loosening its grip on Sutton's skin as she stepped beyond the athletics complex. The late afternoon sun stretched across the pavement in long, forgiving angles, students passing by with the careless momentum of lives unburdened by the quiet dread that had begun settling beneath her ribs. Normalcy was loud out here. Laughter, music leaking from open dorm windows, the distant rumble of traffic beyond campus. It felt almost offensive. Sutton adjusted the strap of her bag, the subtle weight of the scale inside pressing against her awareness with every step. She found herself resisting the urge to check that it was still there. A reflex that felt strangely intimate, like guarding something fragile rather than suspicious. Secrets had a temperature. This one felt cold. She spotted them near the benches outside the student center before they noticed her. The same quiet cluster, conversations softer than the environment around them, grief shaping the negative space between their words. Sloane sat with her elbows on her knees, gaze fixed somewhere beyond the present moment, while Gabe spoke in low tones that sounded more like reassurance than discussion. Finn saw Sutton first. The relief in his expression appeared before he could stop it. "You came back." Not a greeting. An observation weighted with cautious hope. Sutton slowed as she approached, suddenly aware of how easily her presence might feel like intrusion rather than support. Trust didn't begin with answers. It began with showing up without pretending certainty. "I had more questions," she admitted. Sloane looked up, studying her carefully. Not suspicious, not welcoming, simply measuring the distance between curiosity and sincerity. "Did you find anything?" Clara asked. The question landed gently, but Sutton felt the instinct to protect the fragile space of uncertainty tightening around her response. The scale rested in her bag like an accusation she wasn't ready to translate into language. "Not yet," she said. The lie surprised her with how easily it came. Not malicious, not strategic, protective. Cade shifted beside them, attention drifting toward the athletics building in the distance before returning to Sutton with a restlessness he didn't bother hiding. "They won again today," he said quietly. "Another meet, another record." There was admiration in the words, and something dangerously close to longing. Sloane's jaw tightened. "At what cost?" she murmured. The silence that followed felt familiar now, the quiet understanding that certain questions didn't have answers anyone was ready to hear aloud. Sutton watched the way their grief braided together despite disagreement, the invisible threads holding them in orbit even as tension pulled in different directions. She felt it again. That shift, the quiet moment where professional distance dissolved into responsibility. "You think something happened in that pool?" Sutton said softly. It wasn't a question. Gabe hesitated before answering. "I think things happen there that people choose not to see. Winning makes blindness easier." Sutton glanced toward the athletics complex, the glass facade reflecting sunlight in a way that revealed nothing of the world inside. She thought of Lucas's stillness, of Coach Halvern's quiet certainty, of the strange precision that felt less like training and more like design. And the scale, always the scale. "If I asked around," she said slowly, "would people talk?" Finn let out a humorless breath. "People talk," he said. "They just don't say anything that matters." Sloane's gaze held Sutton's longer this time. "You don't have to fix this. Everyone comes here thinking they will." The warning wasn't meant to push her away. It was meant to spare her. Sutton felt the weight of that kindness settle somewhere deeper than she expected. The quiet realization that these were people who had already learned how dangerous hope could be. "I'm not here to fix it," Sutton said. The truth surprised her even as she spoke it. "I just don't want to pretend it isn't happening." Something softened in Sloane's expression. Not trust, not yet, but recognition. Across campus, a whistle echoed faintly from the direction of the pool. Cade's attention shifted again, almost involuntarily. Sutton noticed. And somewhere beneath the warmth of late afternoon sunlight, the unease returned, the subtle sense that the story wasn't only pulling her closer to answers, but pulling others toward the water in ways they might not fully understand. As the group fell back into quiet conversation, Sutton felt the faintest prickle along the back of her neck. The instinct of being watched. She turned. The athletics building stood unchanged, windows reflecting sky and movement, and nothing of the world within. But for a fraction of a second, she thought she saw a figure standing just inside the glass, still, patient, gaze fixed outward, with the calm certainty of someone who already understood how stories like this tended to unfold. When she looked again, the reflection held only sunlight. Still. The feeling didn't fade. and Sutton realized with quiet certainty that whatever existed beneath the surface of that pool had already begun adjusting to her presence. Not reacting. Preparing. Cade told himself he was only passing by. The athletics complex wasn't on the way back to the dorms. Not really. But proximity was an easy lie when curiosity had already made the decision. The late evening air carried the faint scent of chlorine even outside the building, a subtle trace that lingered in the back of his throat like memory rather than environment. He hadn't meant to notice it. Now he couldn't stop. The campus had quieted into that gentle in-between hour where conversations softened and the world seemed temporarily forgiving. Lights glowed behind windows, laughter drifted from distant courtyards, the ordinary pulse of student life continuing with the comfort of routines untouched by absence. But absence was loud when you knew where to listen. Tessa's laugh used to live in spaces like this. Now, silence filled the outline she left behind. Cade slowed as the glass facade of the natatorium came into view, the reflection of the night sky stretching across its surface like dark water. From inside, the pool lights burned a muted blue, softer than daytime, almost secretive, the movement beneath them reduced to blurred shadows rather than defined bodies. Practice should have been over, but the water was never still. He didn't realize he had stopped walking until the automatic doors opened. Warm air wrapped around him immediately, heavy with humidity and the low mechanical hum of filtration that never truly ceased. The sound felt deeper at night, less like background noise and more like breathing, patient, rhythmic, alive in a way that made standing still feel like interruption. Couldn't stay away? Cade turned. Lucas stood a few steps behind him, barefoot on the tile, hair still damp in a way that suggested he had never fully left the water. The friendliness in his voice was easy, unthreatening. The same casual confidence Cade had watched from the stands countless times. But here, without the audience of competition, it felt more intimate, more deliberate. "I was just passing through," Cade said. Lucas smiled slightly. "No one passes through here," he replied. "They either belong or they don't." The words weren't harsh, just certain. Cade glanced toward the pool. A few swimmers moved slowly through the lanes, their motions unhurried, almost meditative. Without the structure of practice, the precision felt less like discipline and more like instinct, bodies returning to water the way lungs return to breath. "They make it look easy," Cade murmured. Lucas followed his gaze. "It isn't. But it's honest." The phrase echoed something Cade couldn't quite place, a familiarity that felt less like coincidence and more like repetition, words spoken often enough to shape belief rather than explain reality. "You ever swim?" Lucas asked. Cade hesitated. "Not like that. That's not what I asked." Lucas stepped closer to the edge of the pool, the water reflecting across his skin in fractured lines of light that shifted with every ripple. He didn't seem wet anymore, not exactly, just adapted to the environment in a way that made the boundary between body and water feel less fixed. "You miss her," Lucas said quietly. The statement landed without warning. Cade's chest tightened. "You didn't know her." Lucas didn't look at him. "You don't have to know someone to recognize the space they leave," he replied. Silence followed, not awkward, not forced, simply present in the way certain truths didn't require argument. The water lapped gently against the tile. "You think she was afraid?" Cade asked before he could stop himself. Lucas finally turned. "No," he said. The certainty was immediate. She was ready. The answer should have felt wrong. Instead, it carried a strange comfort Cade couldn't explain. The idea that fear hadn't defined her last moments, that whatever had happened hadn't been helplessness, but transformation. A thought surfaced. Dangerous, quiet, impossible to dismiss. "What if I wanted to understand?" Cade asked. Lucas's expression didn't change, but something beneath it sharpened. Understanding requires trust, and trust requires willingness to let go of who you were before you arrived. The pool lights flickered softly across the water. Cade felt the pull then, not physical, not coercive, just the subtle gravity of belonging offered without demand. The promise of clarity instead of uncertainty, of answers instead of grief echoing unanswered questions. Lucas stepped into the water without a splash. The surface closed around him like recognition. "You don't have to decide tonight," he said, voice carrying easily across the quiet natatorium. "But the water doesn't lie, Cade. It never has." Cade stood at the edge long after Lucas disappeared beneath the surface, the invitation lingering not as pressure, but possibility. And somewhere beyond the comfort of curiosity, the quiet realization formed that grief and hunger often sounded the same when whispered long enough in the dark. Sutton woke with the sense that something had already happened. Not a sound, not a dream she could recall. Just the quiet, lingering awareness of absence, the way a room felt different after someone left it without saying goodbye. The motel air carried that faint, recycled chill that made mornings feel unfinished, the thin curtains glowing softly with early light that hadn't yet committed to being day. For a moment she lay still, trying to name the discomfort settling beneath her ribs, the instinctive tightening that arrived without explanation. Then she remembered Cade standing at the pool's edge, the way he had looked at the water. Not frightened, not curious, hopeful. The realization pushed her upright before logic could intervene. Her phone showed no missed calls, no messages, nothing urgent enough to justify the knot forming in her stomach, yet the unease refused to loosen, pulling at her thoughts with quiet persistence. Instinct rarely arrived with evidence, it arrived with direction. She dressed quickly, the scale in her bag brushing against her fingers as she reached for her keys. A silent reminder that uncertainty had already crossed into something more tangible. The motel hallway smelled faintly of cleaning solution and stale coffee, ordinary details that felt strangely disconnected from the urgency pressing at the edges of her awareness. Outside, the morning air was too calm. Campus mornings usually carried noise, doors slamming, hurried footsteps, conversations half finished as students rushed toward obligations. Today felt muted, as if the world were waiting for something to begin rather than continuing what had already started. Sutton drove without turning on the radio. Silence felt more honest. The athletics complex appeared ahead sooner than expected, the building's glass reflecting the pale sky in a way that felt almost opaque, hiding movement rather than revealing it. She pulled into the lot and noticed immediately that one car was out of place. Cade's parked closer than usual, angled slightly as if he hadn't taken the time to straighten it. The unease sharpened. Inside, the natatorium lights glowed softly, early practice already underway. The familiar humidity wrapped around her the moment she entered, but this time it felt heavier, not welcoming, not oppressive, simply aware of her presence in a way that made the back of her neck prickle with quiet recognition. She scanned the lanes. The sharks moved through the water with the same flawless precision, morning practice unfolding in rhythmic silence. From a distance, nothing looked wrong. The ordinary choreography of discipline and endurance, bodies moving with confidence, born from repetition. But Cade wasn't in the stands. Sutton's gaze moved to the edge of the pool. Lucas surfaced near the far lane, water sliding from his shoulders as he rested briefly against the wall. When his eyes lifted and found hers across the room, the moment of recognition was immediate. Not surprise, not curiosity, just the calm acknowledgement of someone who had anticipated her arrival. He didn't look away. The quiet certainty in his expression made Sutton's pulse quicken in a way she couldn't justify. She moved toward the stands. Sloane was already there, shoulders tense, gaze scanning the water with the rigid stillness Sutton had come to recognize as fear trying not to become panic. Gabe sat beside her, phone in hand, the screen lighting and dimming repeatedly as if he were hoping persistence alone might produce answers. Finn noticed Sutton first. "He didn't come back last night," he said. No greeting, no explanation. Just truth. Clara's hands trembled slightly where they rested against the railing, eyes fixed on the lanes below as if searching for a shape that refused to reveal itself. Sutton felt the quiet click of inevitability settle into place. The story had moved forward without waiting for her. "When did you last hear from him?" she asked. "Yesterday evening," Gabe replied. "He said he was going for a walk." Sloane's voice was barely more than breath. "He came here. Not speculation, knowing." Sutton looked back at the water. The swimmers continued their laps uninterrupted, movements flawless, synchronized, untouched by the tension unraveling above them. From this distance, it looked like success, dedication, another morning unfolding exactly as it should. But Sutton felt the fracture beneath the surface now, the quiet wrongness that refused to align with what she was seeing. Lucas pushed off the wall and disappeared beneath the water. The surface smoothed instantly. Too instantly. Sutton's hand moved unconsciously toward her bag, fingers brushing the hidden scale like a question she could no longer postpone asking. "I'm going to find him," she said. The words felt less like a decision and more like recognition of a responsibility that had already been assigned. Sloane didn't argue. She only nodded, the relief in the gesture shadowed by the understanding that some searches didn't end with the answers people hoped for. Below them, the water remained calm. But Sutton could feel it now, the subtle awareness of movement beneath visibility, of patterns forming beyond the reach of ordinary observation, of something patient enough to wait until curiosity crossed into proximity. And for the first time since arriving on campus, the unease shifted into something sharper. Not confusion, fear. Not for herself. for Cade. The pool was quieter than Sutton had ever heard it. Not empty, never empty, but subdued in a way that made every sound feel deliberate rather than accidental. Morning practice had ended, leaving only the soft hum of filtration and the faint ripple of disturbed water settling back into practiced calm. Stillness wasn't peaceful here. It felt like waiting. Sutton stood at the edge of the deck long after the others retreated to give her space, Cade's absence pressing against the room with the quiet weight of confirmation no one wanted to name aloud. The scale rested in her palm now, cool and impossibly light, catching the overhead lights in fractured reflections that looked more alive than inert. Evidence without explanation. Proof without context. She approached the lane where Lucas had last surfaced. The water looked ordinary. That was the most unsettling part. Clear. Inviting. Deceptively shallow in the way bright surfaces often were. Sutton. The voice came from behind her. Coach Halvern stood near the benches, posture relaxed, hands folded, with the same quiet patience she had noticed during their first conversation. His expression held neither surprise nor concern, only the gentle composure of someone accustomed to finding others where they were not meant to be. "You shouldn't be here alone," he said. The warning sounded polite. It wasn't. She didn't turn immediately. "Where is Cade?" she asked. Coach Halvern's gaze drifted toward the water. "Finding clarity," he replied. The answer tightened something in Sutton's chest. "That's not an answer." "It is," he said softly. "Just not one you're ready to understand." She finally faced him. The calm in his expression felt different now, not reassuring, not neutral, but anchored in certainty that didn't require her agreement. The friendliness remained intact, yet it no longer felt like warmth, it felt like containment. "You're hurting them," Sutton said. The accusation landed quietly between them. Coach Halvern didn't flinch. "I'm perfecting them," he corrected. The words held no malice, only conviction. They come here fractured by expectation, fear, grief, the quiet mediocrity the world insists they accept. The water offers something better, honesty without negotiation. Sutton's fingers tightened around the scale. "That's not transformation. That's consumption." A flicker of something unreadable passed through his expression. Not anger, not offense, simply recognition that she had reached a conclusion earlier than anticipated. "You see loss," he said. "They experience release." The surface of the pool shifted, not violently, just enough to disrupt the illusion of stillness. Sutton's breath caught as shapes moved beneath the water, silhouettes too fluid, too deliberate to belong to ordinary swimmers. The motion carried intention rather than exertion, bodies gliding through the depths with a familiarity that erased the boundary between human and environment. Lucas surfaced first. The change wasn't grotesque. That was what made it unbearable. His eyes reflected light differently now, depth where there had once been surface, stillness layered over instinct that felt older than speech. The subtle movement of his neck revealed the faint pulsing slits Sutton had only imagined before, breath exchanged without urgency as the water clung to him like recognition rather than resistance. Behind him, others emerged. Not monstrous, adapted. And between them, Cade. His gaze met Sutton's with quiet confusion that softened into something else, relief, perhaps, or the fragile calm of someone finally free from questions that had refused to leave him alone. The tension that had defined him for weeks seemed absent now, grief replaced by an unsettling serenity that felt less like healing and more like surrender. "He's not gone," Coach Halvern said gently. "He's arrived." Cade moved closer to the edge, movements smoother than Sutton had ever seen, water parting around him as if it had always known him. For a moment she saw the boy who had sat in the stands searching for answers that no one could give him. Then the water reflected something new. "You don't have to be afraid," Cade said quietly. The words broke her. Not because they were threatening, because he believed them. Sutton stepped back, the enormity of the realization settling into her chest with suffocating clarity. This wasn't abduction, wasn't violence in the way she understood it. It was invitation accepted, grief reshaped into belonging, so complete it erased the desire to return. "That's not choice," she whispered. Lucas watched her with quiet sympathy. "It is," he said. "You just don't recognize the language it's spoken in." The water stilled again, patient, waiting. Sutton felt the pull then, not physical, not coercive, but the quiet promise of answers, of certainty, of an end to the relentless human ache of uncertainty. The invitation Cade had felt lingered at the edges of her own thoughts now, seductive in its simplicity. Coach Halvern's voice softened. "You were always meant to see. Some stories don't exist to be told, they exist to be joined." Sutton looked at Cade. At the calm replacing grief, at the belonging replacing absence, at the quiet understanding that what waited beneath the surface wasn't death, but transformation that required surrender she could never give. She closed her hand around the scale. "I'm not staying," she said. Not defiant, certain. For the first time, Coach Halvern's composure faltered. Not anger, not disappointment, simply acceptance of a variable he could not control. "That's the tragedy of observers," he murmured. "You see truth, but you cannot live inside it." The swimmers slipped beneath the surface again, Cade lingering only a moment longer before the water reclaimed him without struggle. The pool returned to stillness. But Sutton understood now that stillness didn't mean absence. It meant patience. As she stepped away from the edge, the weight of what she carried shifted, no longer a mystery to solve, but a truth she would have to live beside without proof, without closure, without the comfort of resolution. Behind her, the water remained calm. And somewhere beneath that calm, belonging waited for the next person, grief made curious enough to listen.
I still smell chlorine when there isn't any. It happens in ordinary places, grocery stores, parking lots, the quiet stretch of road outside my apartment when the air turns humid enough to hold memory. The scent arrives without warning, faint and metallic, and for a moment I'm back there again, standing at the edge of water that looked harmless until I understood what patience really meant. People keep asking if I ever finished the story. I tell them yes, because technically I did. The team kept winning. The school kept celebrating. The missing persons reports faded into smaller columns, then footnotes, then nothing at all. Success is very good at burying questions. Sometimes I sit with Sloan and the others, and we talk about Cade the way people talk about someone who moved away rather than vanished. Gentle past tense, careful laughter, memories handled like fragile objects we don't fully trust ourselves to keep holding. It hurts less that way, not because we believe it, because we need to survive it. I still have the scale. It lives in the back of my desk drawer, tucked inside an envelope I never labeled, something I touch on nights when doubt feels easier than truth. The surface hasn't dulled. It still catches light like it's alive, shifting colors in ways that don't belong to anything that should exist outside water. Proof no one would believe, truth that doesn't want witnesses. Sometimes, when the world is too loud and the ache of unanswered questions presses against the quiet spaces in my chest, I think about Cade's face in the water, the calm that replaced grief, the belonging that looked so much like peace it almost convinced me. That's the part that scares me. Not the transformation. The comfort. Because there are nights when the loneliness of being the one who walked away feels heavier than the terror of what I saw beneath the surface. Nights when certainty feels like mercy and curiosity feels like punishment. When the idea of answers without pain becomes dangerously seductive. I understand the invitation now. That's the real horror. Understanding without surrender. Living beside a truth you can't expose, can't fix, can't forget. Only carry quietly while the world continues celebrating victories built on questions no one is brave enough to ask. I don't go back to the pool, but sometimes when I pass the building at night, I swear I can see movement beneath the surface through the glass, shapes gliding with impossible ease, patient as tides, existing in a world that doesn't need witnesses to continue. I wonder if Cade remembers us. I wonder if remembering hurts. And sometimes, when the air is humid enough, when the night is quiet enough, when grief feels loud enough to echo, I wonder how long it takes before curiosity starts sounding like belonging.